Is it one rule for the banks and another for the rest of us? Well, earlier I asked Simon Rose from the group SaveOurSavers for his reaction.
Well, like everybody, I'm slightly dismayed that the banks are paying themselves so much for mismanaging businesses. In any rational world, you would expect bonuses to be paid for excellent performance. We don't seem to see that from the banks, I'm afraid. But then that's part of the problem of this too big to fail idea that banks will just get bailed out by the taxpayer if they do terribly. So what sort of business model is it? If you do incredibly well, then you get paid wonderfully, you get these bonuses and you deserve them. If you do badly, don't worry, it's all right. The taxpayer will step in and make sure that you still get paid your bonuses. It is quite an extraordinary situation.
However, people will say, well, or the bank certainly will say, well, if we hadn't been bailed out, then what would have happened then?
Well, we've got one example where the banks weren't bailed out, and that's in Iceland, which admittedly is a much smaller country. But there they just decided they didn't have the money to bail out their banks, which had overextended themselves to a similar extent to the Royal Bank of Scotland. And they let the banks fail. They stood behind them so that the high street operations, the domestic operations, what you and I actually expect a bank to do, were kept going. The rest of the stuff was jettisoned. And they also, which has never happened in this country, decided to prosecute some of the bankers for fraud. And I think a lot of people are very angry with the banks, not just about the way they're paying these bonuses, but why have we poured so much money into them, and why have no bankers been held to account? When the banks are setting aside over £20 billion together for mis-selling PPI alone, and then they got mis-selling for lots of other products. They've got colluding in the foreign exchange markets, colluding in the LIBOR market, and all these things. Now, all of these are actually against the law, and yet not one banker has even been prosecuted, let alone sent to prison. And it does appear to me at SaveOurSavers, and I imagine to many people, that there now seems to be one law for the bankers and one law for everybody else. And it's really just not on.
So in a way, you seem to be saying that you'd rather have seen RBS and other banks fail if they hadn't been meeting correct standards, and you want more accountability.
Well, they are accountable. The problem is the regulators were asleep at the wheel before it happened. They should have known exactly what was going on. It's not as though RBS was a small company. At one stage, briefly, it was the largest company in the world. But yes, I feel that we have spent far too much money on these banks. What you and I probably want from a bank is a high street operation that takes in money from people, pays them a bit of interest, and that lends money to other people. The banks are appalling at this. They're planning on shutting 1 in 4 high street branches in the next 5 years. So where is all this money going? It's going to the investment banking, to the casino side of it, not to actually keeping high street banking going.
So why has there then, do you think, only been one new high street bank competing with the established names in the past 100 years? I mean, where is the incentive? Is that what's going wrong here?
Well, it's not that there's no incentive. I do know there are many people who do want to set up banks. You may have seen that wonderful programme on Channel 4 with Dave Fishwick, just a minibus company man who realised the banks weren't lending money to his customers to buy minibuses, so he set up his own bank, the Bank of Dave in Burnley. Now, he's been phenomenally successful, but the problems he had, both of the regulators and other banks trying to crowd him out. We've got a virtual monopoly of banks in this country. It is incredibly expensive for new banks to come into operation, partly because of the incredible regulations. It's fine for the big banks. They've got the money. It's very hard for anybody new to come in. The one thing I think that would shake up the banks more than anything else is not more regulation, because the regulation is always shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. It's always facing the previous crisis. The real way of getting our bankers to shape up is by introducing proper competition. So for once, they can't just sit back and collect their bonuses. They've got to actually do something to earn them.
Is that going to happen, though? I mean, realistically, what do you think are the prospects for Britain's banks in the future?
I worry immensely. I think 5 years of record low interest rates has effectively been a backdoor bailout to the banks. It's meant that they have not had to expose the incredible bad loans that are still lurking on their balance sheets. I don't think this is going to be the last big loss we're going to see from people like Royal Bank of Scotland, for instance. But I do know that there are quite firm moves by government to try and get new banks to operate. And you may have heard of these groups of firms called peer-to-peer lenders, where you're matching off borrowers and savers. Now, that has expanded. It's doubled in the last year, that market, because people are desperate to find more interest on their money, but also because the banks have been so bad at lending to small and medium-sized businesses, which is where future growth lies. Now, it may well be that what actually happens is we see something like the peer-to-peer market continuing to grow, and eventually people will just sidestep the banks. If they don't provide a service to the public, then if there's a way of avoiding them, I think people should be able to.
And do you think we'll ever trust the banks again, Simon?
I think it's extremely hard to. We keep hearing, in fact, we've heard for 6 years, various chief executives of banks say, oh, you'll be able to trust us in future. You know, we're going to clean up our act. Everything will be absolutely super in future. Well, I've heard it so many times, and yet every time a bank produces results, there are yet more billions for having missold products or having connived in markets. I mean, just to briefly summarize, the banks collectively, not every single one of them, have missold PPI, they've missold interest rate swaps, they've missold structured accounts, they have colluded to fix the interest rate through LIBOR, they've colluded in foreign exchange markets. We heard of banks breaking sanctions against regimes that are banned. We've heard of them laundering drugs money. And yet not one banker has ever had his collar felt. I do despair. I hope eventually the authorities will get on top of this. But, you know, we've had 6 years of this so far. We don't seem to be much further ahead.
Is it really 6 years? My goodness, well, it is. So he's not very happy. That was Simon Rose from the group SaveOurSavers.